The morning Belle Bishop arrived in Caldera Flats, Texas. A dust storm swallowed the stagecoach whole and spat it out half a mile past the depot, and that was how she knew the town was not going to be gentle with her. She stepped down from the coach with a carpet bag in one hand and a cast-iron skillet wrapped in a flour sack in the other. Her dark hair half escaped from its pins, her dress the color of old cream and streaked now with red Texas dust. She was 24 years old, she had $47 to her name, and she had taken a job as a cook and housekeeper on a cattle ranch called the Copper Bell, a position advertised in the San Antonio Gazette with a terseness that matched the man who had placed it. Cook and housekeeper wanted. Copper Bell Ranch, Caldera Flats, wages $12 per month, room and board provided. No nonsense. She had answered the advertisement because she had no better options, and because the words "no nonsense" had appealed to her in a way she could not entirely explain. She had spent 3 years in San Antonio keeping house for a widow named Mrs. Elspeth Craw, who had been very fond of nonsense, and whose household had been so full of it that Belle had come to regard plain-spoken economy as something close to grace. The town of Caldera Flats in the year 1878 was not a large place. There was a main street with a general store, a livery stable, a barber shop that also served as the dentist's office, a saloon called the Blue Spur, a church made of adobe, a small school, and a post office that was also the telegraph office. The surrounding land was brushy and tan, and stretched in every direction toward horizons that looked painted on, low hills purple in the distance, the sky enormous and pale with heat. It was the kind of country that either broke a person or made them very certain of themselves, and Belle had not yet decided which it was going to do to her. She asked directions at the general store from a man named Hector Ruiz, who ran it with his wife, and who pointed her south along the main road, and told her the Copper Bell was about 4 miles out, that she could not miss it because of the copper-colored weather vane shaped like a bell that sat on top of the main barn. She did not have a horse. She had not thought to arrange one, having assumed someone would meet her. She started walking. The road south was deeply rutted and flanked on both sides by mesquite and prickly pear, and the heat was a living thing that pressed against her from every direction. She had been walking for perhaps 40 minutes, her carpet bag growing heavier with every step, when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She moved to the edge of the road and turned. The man riding toward her was on a dark bay horse, a big animal that moved with the slightly impatient quality of something that preferred to go faster. The man himself was tall in the saddle, in the way of someone who had been in a saddle so long he no longer thought about it. He wore a battered hat the color of tobacco, a gray work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and canvas trousers dusty at the knee. He had a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same caliche rock as the hills, dark eyes set under straight brows, and a mouth that was not unkind but was also very clearly not accustomed to being idle. He pulled up beside her and looked down at her without particular surprise, as though women walking alone on the South Road carrying cast-iron skillets were a routine occurrence. "You the new cook?" he said. "I am," Belle said. "If you're Martin Monroe." "I am," he said. He looked at her carpet bag, then at the skillet, then at her face. "Forgot the coach came in today." It was such a plain admission, not apologetic exactly, just stated, that she almost smiled. "That is all right," she said. "I'm a capable walker." He swung down from the horse in one motion, took the carpet bag from her hand before she could object, and tied it to the back of his saddle. He did not offer to help her onto the horse. He simply handed her the reins and said, "You ride." "Yes," she said. "Then ride, I'll walk." "That seems backwards," she said. "You've been walking in the heat," he said, as if this resolved the question entirely, and began walking south. She looked at him for a moment, then put her foot in the stirrup and swung up. The bay horse was well-mannered and walked quietly beside the man. They went the remaining distance to the ranch in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which Belle found notable. The Copper Bell was a working ranch in the full sense of the term, and it showed in the honest, unsentimental way of things that are used hard and maintained carefully. The main house was built of cedar plank and native stone, a long, low structure with a wide porch running across the front. Behind it stood the big barn with the copper bell weather vane turning slowly in the hot air, two smaller outbuildings, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden that needed water, and four wooden corrals where a dozen horses stood switching their tails at flies. Beyond the corrals, the land opened up into grazing pasture, and Belle could see cattle moving in the distance, and two cowhands on horseback moving among them. Martin Monroe took her on a brief and efficient tour. The kitchen was large and well-equipped by the standards of 1878, with a cast-iron stove, a dry sink with a pump handle that drew from the well, shelving for provisions, a work table, and a window that faced east and caught the morning light. Her room was off the kitchen, small but private, with a cot, a chest of drawers, a washstand, and a hook on the wall. It was clean. She appreciated that. He showed her the provisions, the root cellar, the smokehouse stores, the garden, and told her that the ranch ran 3 full-time hands besides himself, that they ate breakfast at 5:30 in the morning, dinner at noon when possible, supper at 6 in the evening, and that they expected plain good food and got along fine without fancy. He said all of this standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand, looking somewhere between businesslike and slightly out of his element, as though he was accustomed to giving orders about cattle and fencing but found the domestic orientation faintly foreign. "Any questions?" he said. "What do the hands dislike?" she said. He looked at her with something that was almost interest. "Pardon. Every man has something he won't eat. I find it easier to ask at the beginning than to discover it the hard way when someone pushes their plate away." A pause. "Emmett Walsh won't touch onions. Something happened to him with onions when he was young and he has never recovered. Cody Fitch will eat anything placed in front of him, no exception. Old Pete Garland is missing his back teeth on the left side, so hard bread gives him trouble." He paused again. "I don't eat sweet things. Not even fruit," she said. "Not if I can help it." "All right," she said, and that was that. He left her to settle in, and she did, quickly and efficiently, the way she did most things. She unpacked her carpet bag, hung her 2 other dresses, set her Bible and her mother's recipe book on the chest of drawers, and put her cast-iron skillet on the stove where it belonged. Then she assessed the kitchen properly and made a list of what was needed, and by 4 in the afternoon had started a venison stew from the smoked meat in the smokehouse and a pan of cornbread, and by 6, when the hands came in from the pasture, the kitchen smelled like something worth coming home to. The 3 cowhands were exactly as Martin had described them. Emmett Walsh was a lean, sunburned man of about 35 with a quiet manner who said please and thank you, and moved his stew bowl slightly away from the bread basket with the automatic caution of a man who had once been surprised by onions and was not prepared to be surprised again. She had not put onions in the stew. He ate 2 helpings without comment, which she understood to be the compliment it was. Cody Fitch was younger, perhaps 20, with red hair and an enthusiasm for everything edible that was almost moving in its purity. Old Pete Garland was somewhere past 60, gray-whiskered and slow-moving, with a courtesy that belonged to an earlier era and a tendency to chew only on the right side of his mouth. She had made the cornbread soft. Martin Monroe ate at the end of the table, apart but not unfriendly, and he ate efficiently and without comment, which she was beginning to understand was his natural mode of existing in the world. He was not cold. He was simply a man who had organized himself around function and had not left much room for decoration. After supper, she washed up and went to sit on the back step in the cooling evening air and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night, the horses in the corrals, a coyote calling from somewhere in the distance, the low conversation of the hands over by the bunkhouse. The sky over the western hills had gone the deep orange and purple of a bruise healing toward beauty, and Belle sat with her hands in her lap and thought that this place, this strange, stark, honest place, might be somewhere she could stay for a while. She had been in Caldera Flats exactly 1 day. The weeks that followed established themselves into a routine, with the naturalness of water finding its level. Belle rose before 5, started the stove, put the coffee on, and had breakfast ready when the men came in. She cleaned, baked, tended the kitchen garden, preserved what could be preserved, and cooked 3 meals a day with the steady, unsentimental competence of someone who genuinely understood food and what it meant to working people. The hands warmed to her quickly. Emmett began to bring her wildflowers occasionally, small bunches of desert marigold and bluestem that he left on the kitchen windowsill without comment, a gesture of appreciation so indirect and dignified that she found it touching. Cody told her 3 times in the first week that her biscuits were the best he had ever eaten, and he said it each time as though it had just occurred to him for the first time. Old Pete called her Miss Belle from the first day and held the door for her whenever he was near a door, a habit of another era that she received graciously. Martin Monroe was harder to read. He was not unfriendly. He spoke to her directly and without condescension, asked her opinion on the garden and on provisions with the genuine interest of someone who respected competence. Occasionally at supper he would make a remark, dry and brief, about some event of the day, a difficult calf or a problem with the north fence line, and she would respond, and for a few minutes there would be an easy back and forth between them before he withdrew again into his natural quietness. He paid her wages on the first of each month without being reminded. He fixed the loose board on the kitchen porch within 2 days of her mentioning it, and the stuck window in her room within 1, and she had mentioned both things only once, in passing, without expectation. She learned the shape of him slowly, the way you learn a place by living in it. He worked from before dawn until after dark, a fact that was not boastfulness but simply his rhythm. He was 31 years old. He had built the Copper Belle from essentially nothing over the past 7 years, having arrived in Caldera Flats at 24 with a small inheritance, a strong back, and the particular stubborn vision that either builds something lasting or ruins a man entirely. In his case, it had built something lasting, but she was beginning to suspect it had also cost him a great deal that he never spoke about. She noticed that he did not celebrate anything. Not the 4th of July, when the town put on a small parade and there was a dance at the church hall. His hands went in. He stayed at the ranch and mended tack. Not the first good rain of the season in late September, when Cody and Emmett came whooping into the yard, and old Pete stood on the bunkhouse porch with his face tilted up to the water with an expression of pure gratitude. Martin stood in the barn doorway and watched the rain fall with a flat, neutral regard, as though he was simply noting a fact. Not Christmas in December. She made a proper Christmas dinner with a roasted goose she had been fattening since October, sweet potato pudding for the hands, and nothing sweet for Martin, dried apple fritters for Cody, who had mentioned they reminded him of his mother, and a mince pie that old Pete ate 3 slices of with the solemn appreciation of a man receiving a sacrament. Martin ate the goose and the beans and the bread rolls and thanked her sincerely, and when she had set a small piñon pine bough over the fireplace with a bit of red ribbon, he had looked at it the way a man looks at something in a language he does not speak but finds oddly worth studying. She did not push. She was not a woman who pushed. But she paid attention. In late October, she had occasion to visit Hector Ruiz at the general store to arrange the monthly provisions, and while she was there his wife, Maria Ruiz, a small brisk woman with the kind of practical warmth that made everyone within range of it feel slightly more organized, mentioned Martin Monroe in the course of a longer conversation about the ranchers in the area. "He has been here since '71, Maria said, weighing out flour. "Came alone. No family that anyone knows of. He keeps to himself, which people respect here because they do the same. He is fair with his accounts and does not run up debt, which Hector says is the truest measure of a man's character in this country." She paused. "He had a foreman who was with him from the beginning, a man named Roy Caldwell. Roy died 3 years ago, fever. Martin took it hard, though he did not show it to anyone. He never shows anything to anyone, which is perhaps the trouble. Belle said she had noticed he was a private man. He is, Maria said, but he is not a hard man. There is a difference. Belle thought about that on the ride back to the ranch. She also, in the way of a person who pays attention to detail because it is simply her nature, began to notice certain things. The ranch's founding papers, which she saw once when Martin was looking through his desk for something and she happened to be in the main room, were dated September 1871. She knew, from a brief reference Emmett had made in passing, that Martin had come to Caldera Flats in the summer of that year and had filed his claim that autumn. One afternoon in early November, while she was writing down a list of provisions and checking the calendar she kept tacked inside the pantry door, she noticed that Emmett's birthday had been in October, a fact she knew because Cody had mentioned it, and because she had made a small spice cake for Emmett, who had turned red and said she had not needed to do that and then eaten half the cake himself. She had written birthdays down when she learned them, just dates in the margin of her calendar, a habit from her years in San Antonio where she had kept track of Mrs. Craw's social obligations. She did not know Martin's birthday. She found herself curious about this in a way that surprised her a little. She was not in the habit of being particularly curious about her employers, but Martin Monroe was not quite like any employer she had had before, and she was not, if she was honest with herself, entirely certain that what she felt about him was employer-adjacent anymore. She was in love with him. She recognized this the way you recognize a change in the weather, not all at once but in accumulation, in the successive small evidences until the fact becomes undeniable. She had been in the process of falling in love with him since approximately the second week of October, when she had come out to the barn early one morning to get eggs from the nest a hen had made in the hay, and had found Martin sitting on an overturned bucket in the dim gold light, with a very young calf that had been rejected by its mother, holding a feeding bottle and talking to the calf in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, about the weather and the grass and the state of the north fence, in the tone of someone who understood that a frightened young thing needed the sound of a human voice more than it needed the words. He had not heard her come in. She had stood very still and watched for about 30 seconds and then retreated quietly, and that was that. She had not been able to undo it since. She went to visit Maria Ruiz again in mid-November on a pretext of provisions, and in the course of the visit mentioned, with the casualness of someone making conversation, that she found it difficult to thank someone properly for a job when you did not know them well, that she liked to acknowledge people, small gestures, a meal made to someone's particular taste. And how did you know what a person's particular tastes were when they told you very little about themselves? Maria had looked at her with the perceptiveness of a woman who has been reading people for 50 years and said, "You are asking about Martin Monroe." Belle had looked out the window. "He was born in the first week of March," Maria said, 1847. He mentioned it once to Hector in passing, something about the year, and Hector remembered. Ranchers have a way of telling you their ages without meaning to. She paused. The exact date I could not say. Belle thanked her and went back to the ranch. She thought about it for a while. March, 1847, which meant he was 31, which she had already known. And which meant, most importantly, that his birthday was coming in approximately 4 months. She tucked the information away and said nothing. The winter on the Caldera Flats was not as brutal as further north, but it had its own character, dry cold that came off the plains in the night and turned the water troughs to ice by morning, frost that silvered the mesquite, days of pale thin sun that gave light without warmth. Belle kept the kitchen warm and the food substantial, thick bean soups, slow-cooked beef, pan bread and potato cakes. And on the days when the cold came in serious, she made the hands hot coffee before they went out and had it ready when they came in. And this small thing, the predictability of warmth, seemed to matter to them more than she could have imagined when she first came. Martin worked through the cold as he worked through everything else, with a steady, unvarying application that she was beginning to understand, was not the absence of feeling, but was in fact its own kind of expression. A man who showed what he valued by what he gave his time to. He gave his time to this land and these animals and these few people, and in that she was beginning to read the full vocabulary of him. They talked more in the winter, naturally, because the cold drew people closer to the fire and closer to the kitchen, and sometimes after supper was done and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, Martin would sit at the kitchen table with his coffee while she cleaned up, and they would talk. About small things at first, the condition of the herd, the prospects for spring grass, a letter he had received from a cattle buyer in Fort Worth. Then about larger things. He asked her once where she was from, and she told him, Missouri originally, a town called Hartwell, that she had come south with her father after her mother died when Belle was 17, that her father had been a farmer and not a good one, that he had died of pneumonia in San Antonio in the winter of 1875, and left her entirely alone and entirely without options, and that she had kept house for Mrs. Craw for 3 years, and then seen the advertisement, and here she was. She told it plainly, without self-pity, because it was simply what had happened. He listened with the full, unhurried attention he gave to things he considered worth attending to, and when she was done he said, "That is a hard road." "It was the road I had," she said. He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression she could not quite read. Then he said, "I'm from Illinois. My parents both died when I was 19. Fever, same summer, 3 weeks apart. I worked for other men for 4 years and saved what I could and came here with $1,000 and a very clear idea of what I wanted to build." "The Copper Bell," she said. "The Copper Bell," he said. She turned back to the washing up and he drank his coffee and they were quiet for a while, but it was the kind of quiet that is full rather than empty. After that the kitchen conversations became a regular thing, and she looked forward to them with a feeling she tried not to examine too closely, because examining it had nowhere useful to go. She was his employee. She had a room off the kitchen. She was 24 years old and he was 31, and they were building something between them that was made of evenings and coffee and plain talk, and the accumulated trust of 2 people who had each been alone for a long time, and she was deeply afraid of it and deeply grateful for it in equal measure. In January, she found the receipt. She had been helping Martin find an old invoice from a saddle maker in Abilene, the kind of organizational task that occasionally fell to her when the ranch paperwork had got itself into the state that men's ranch paperwork inevitably achieved. And in the bottom of the wooden box where he kept older documents she found, under a leather bill of sale and a surveyor's map, a folded piece of paper that turned out to be an old receipt from a general store in some Illinois town, dated March 5th, 1866, for items purchased by a J. Monroe, presumably a family member. The receipt was not important, but the date was March 5th. She looked at it for a moment, then folded it carefully back the way she had found it and replaced it in the box, and put the invoice she had been looking for on the desk and did not say anything. March 5th, 1847. He would be 32 years old in 6 weeks. She knew, with a certainty she could not entirely explain, that no one on this ranch or in this town had ever marked it. Not because they did not care about him, because Emmett Walsh clearly did in his spare, Texan way, and old Pete clearly did, and even Cody in his younger, noisier way, but because Martin Monroe had never given anyone permission to care about the date. He did not celebrate anything. She had watched him for 5 months, and that much was clear. He did not celebrate things because he had long ago decided that the gap between what celebrations represented and what he had actually experienced was too wide to bridge with a cake and a round of well wishes. She suspected she knew the shape of what lay behind that. A man who lost both parents at 19, who had built something out of nothing through sheer stubborn labor, who had lost the one friend who had been with him through all of it to fever. A man like that did not emerge from the experience eager to mark occasions. Occasions had not been kind to him. He had learned not to expect anything from them. But she was going to make him a pie. She decided this on a Tuesday afternoon in January while she was putting up the last of the dried apples from the fall stores, and once she had decided it, she felt a calm settle over her that she recognized as the feeling of a thing being right. Not because it would change anything, not because she thought a pie would open some door between them that was closed, but because he deserved to have someone know the date. He deserved to have someone notice. She kept it to herself. She did not tell Emmett or Cody or Pete. She did not want it to become a production, a made thing, an event that he would have to manage. She wanted it to be simply, quietly, a pie. She spent the following weeks in a state of careful, enjoyable planning. She thought about what to make. He did not eat sweet things, which was a significant constraint. She thought about it for several days and then went back to what she knew about him. And what she knew about him was that he was a man of plain, honest flavors, no sugar coating, nothing elaborate. She thought about a savory pie, a proper meat pie with a good crust, the kind of thing that was a meal and a ceremony all at once. She would use the good beef, slow-cooked, with herbs from the garden, and make a crust that was more butter than lard, the kind that shattered beautifully when cut. It would be something he would actually want to eat. It would be his. She ordered the extra butter quietly as part of the regular provisions in early February, unremarkable among the other supplies. She dried the rosemary herself from the kitchen garden. She had grown up watching her mother make pastry and had been making it herself since she was 12 years old, and the crust was one of the things she was genuinely proud of. February moved on. The cold began to ease slightly, the way it did in West Texas, not with the drama of a northern thaw but with a slow, quiet retreat, the days a few degrees warmer, the nights still cold but the mornings promising. The cattle were coming through the winter well. Martin rode out every day to check on them and came back with the satisfied tightness around his eyes of a man whose gamble is paying off. Their kitchen conversations had deepened. He had started arriving with a deliberateness that she noticed, not lingering accidentally, but coming to the table as though he intended to be there, pouring his coffee and sitting down with the ease of someone who had decided this was a place he belonged. He had told her about Roy Caldwell, the foreman who died, told it briefly and without ornamentation, but she understood it was not a story he told people. He had told her about the first winter on the ranch, when he had lived alone in a tent for 6 weeks while the main house was being built, feeding himself on beans and dried venison, and she had laughed at the image, a 24-year-old man in a Texas winter in a tent with beans, and he had looked at her with that almost smile of his that was more a thing in the eyes than on the mouth, and said, "It built character," and she had said, "or stubbornness," and he had said, "That too." On a cold, clear evening in late February, she was rolling out the practice crust, not the real one. She wanted to make sure the recipe was right, when Martin came into the kitchen unexpectedly. She had thought he was in the barn. She did not have time to cover anything and simply stood there with flour on her hands while he looked at the work table with its pastry and its rolling pin and the dish sitting beside it. "Late to be baking," he said. "I'm testing a recipe," she said. He got his coffee from the stove and sat down. "What kind?" "Savory pie," she said. "Good crust for that," he said, looking at it. She felt her cheeks warm and was grateful the kitchen was already warm from the stove. "Thank you." He sat with his coffee and she continued working, and they talked about the practice that spring was going to bring, the branding and the moving of cattle to the north pasture, the hands that would need to be added seasonally. It was a normal conversation. It was a normal evening, and yet she was aware of him with a specificity that made the air in the kitchen feel slightly different from ordinary air, as if it had a higher concentration of something she could not name. "Belle," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was different from the sound of it in anyone else's voice, lower, more careful, as though he was treating it with some particular regard. She looked up. He was looking at his coffee cup. "I am aware," he said slowly, the way a man speaks when he is constructing something with more care than usual, "that working here for a person like me is not the most comfortable situation. I mean to say I am not easy company." "I did not come here for easy company," she said. He looked up then. His eyes were very dark in the kitchen lamplight. "No," he said, "I don't suppose you did." A silence. The stove crackled. "I think you are easier company than you believe," she said, and went back to her pastry. He did not say anything else for a while. Then he said, "Good night, Belle," and got up and went out, and she stood at the work table and let out a long, slow breath and thought, well, that is where things are. She was in love with him, and it was going to keep being a fact whether she did anything about it or not, and she was going to make him a pie for his birthday and see what happened after that. March arrived the way it always does, without fanfare, a turn of the calendar page. The 4th fell on a Sunday, which meant the 5th would be a Monday, a full working day, no different from any other to the naked eye. She planned accordingly. On Saturday evening, after supper, she prepared what could be prepared ahead of time, trimmed and cut the beef into proper pieces, made the broth, wrapped the pastry dough in damp cloth and kept it cool in the root cellar overnight. She did all of this after the kitchen was otherwise clean and the house quiet, working in the lamplight with the careful pleasure of someone making something that matters. On Sunday she went to church in town with old Pete, who went every week without fail, and who she had fallen into the habit of accompanying. On the ride back he mentioned that it would be a fine spring, and that he thought the grazing land south of the creek would be ready for cattle by April if the rain came in right. She agreed and thought about the beef and the crust sitting in the root cellar. Monday morning, March 5th, 1879, Belle Bishop got up an hour earlier than usual. She had the kitchen to herself in the dark before dawn, with only the lamp she lit and the growing orange heat of the stove for company. She made the regular breakfast first, the biscuits and the bacon and the eggs and the coffee, all of it ready and waiting for 5:30. Then, in the time between the making and the eating, she took the beef from where it had been slowly cooking since 4 in the morning in the back of the stove, tasted it, adjusted the herbs, and turned her attention to the crust. It was a good crust. She could tell by the feel of it, the way it responded to her hands, the right temperature, the right amount of butter worked through, the way it rolled out with a suppleness that was also strength. She lined the deep dish with it, filled it with the beef and the dark herbs and broth mixture, sealed the top, crimped the edge with her thumb in the old way her mother had shown her, and put it in the oven. The men came in for breakfast. She fed them. Martin sat at his place at the end of the table and ate his biscuits and drank his coffee and looked out the window at the early morning light touching the hills with gold, and she moved around the kitchen normally, refilling cups, bringing the bacon dish, and said nothing about the pie in the oven. After breakfast the men went out. She cleaned up. The pie baked. At noon she pulled it from the oven and set it on the rack to cool slightly and stood back and looked at it. The crust had gone the deep amber gold of something that had been treated properly, the edges crimped in her mother's pattern, the top risen slightly with the heat inside. It smelled of rosemary and browned beef and butter, and she thought it was the best thing she had made since she came to the Copper Bell. At 12:30 Martin came in from the north pasture for dinner, the midday meal. He came in through the back door, which meant he came through the kitchen, which meant he stopped. He saw the pie on the cooling rack. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at her. "That's not the regular dinner," he said. "No," she said. She was standing at the stove, calm on the outside in the way of someone who has decided on a thing and is committed to it. "That is your birthday pie." He went very still. She turned from the stove and looked at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand, dusty from the morning's work, and his expression was something she had not seen on him before, not the flat neutrality, not the almost smile, but something cracked open in a way that was clearly not what he was accustomed to. "My birthday," he said. "March 5th, she said. "You are 32 years old today." A silence that had a lot in it. "How did you know the date?" he said. "I found the receipt," she said simply. In the document box back in January. I did not mean to look, but I saw it and I remembered it. He looked at the pie, then he looked at her. I haven't had a birthday pie since I was about 15 years old, he said, and his voice was level, but there was something underneath it that was not. It is a savory pie, she said. Nothing sweet. Beef and rosemary with the good butter crust. I know you don't eat sweet things. He set his hat on the peg by the door and walked to the cooling rack and stood looking at the pie for a moment. She watched him. He put one hand on the edge of the rack, not touching the pie, just standing close to it, and he was quiet for so long that she began to wonder if she had miscalculated, if this was a thing she should not have done, if the privacy he kept around himself was more than a habit and was in fact a wall he had built for a reason. Then he said, without looking up, "Belle." "Yes," she said. "Thank you." It was only 2 words, but the way he said them carried the weight of a much longer speech. She understood that he was not only thanking her for the pie, that he was thanking her for the knowing, for the noticing, for the decision to act on the noticing rather than to leave it alone, for the year's worth of quiet attention that had preceded the act. "You're welcome," she said. "Now sit down and let me cut it properly." He sat down. She cut the pie and put a generous slice in front of him and stood at the work table and watched him take the first bite. He was quiet for a moment, chewing, and then he said, "That is a very good pie." "I am glad," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. The other men came in for dinner and there was pie enough for everyone, though she had clearly made it with Martin's preferences in mind. And the meal had a different quality than the usual midday one, something slightly celebratory, not loud, not made into an event, but present in the way the good food was, in the way everyone ate slightly more slowly, attending to it. Cody said it was the best thing he had ever put in his mouth, which he said about most things, but said about this with a sincerity that Belle thought was genuine. Emmett asked what the herb was, and she told him, and he nodded as if adding this to a private store of knowledge. Old Pete said it reminded him of a pie his grandmother had made in Georgia before the war, and there was a moment of quiet at the table that acknowledged what that meant without anyone saying so. Martin did not say much. He ate his pie and drank his coffee and watched her from the end of the table with an expression she had not seen before and could not entirely parse, something watchful and inward and warm all at once. After the meal, when the men had gone back out and she was washing the dishes, he came back into the kitchen. He had something in his hand, she could not tell what. He set it on the work table beside the dish she was washing. It was a small jar of wild honey, the kind that was sold sometimes at the general store, made by a man who kept bees on the edge of town. "I don't eat sweet things," he said, "but I know you do." She stared at the jar for a moment, then looked at him. He was standing close, closer than was strictly necessary, and he was looking at her with that open, cracked-open expression from before, which she understood was simply Martin Monroe without his ordinary armor, and he was somewhat undone, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "You thought about what I like," she said. "I have been thinking about a great deal where you are concerned," he said, and his voice was very low and very even, the way it was when he was saying something that cost him. The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside a horse moved in the corral. "Martin," she said. "I know what my situation is," he said carefully, the words measured out. "I know I am not a man who makes himself easy to care for. I know I have not given you much to work with in the way of conversation and sociability. I know that there is a gap between what I feel and what I say that most people find frustrating, and I know that you have been patient with it." He paused. I did not know what to do with that patience except to be grateful for it and to try not to take advantage of it. "You have not taken advantage of anything," she said. "I do not know how to say certain things plainly," he said. "I have been trying to find the plain version of a particular thing for approximately 3 months." She turned to face him fully. Her hands were wet and she dried them on her apron and looked at him and waited. "I think about you," he said. "I think about you in a way that is not about the cooking or the household, which is very fine, but is about you specifically, about the person you are. The way you talk to Pete about his grandmother, The way you argued with me about the north fence design last November and were right. The way you got up at 4 in the morning today for a man who has never given you any reason to think the date mattered to anyone. I think about you, and I find that the ranch is better when you are in it, and I am better when I am talking to you, and I wanted you to know that." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window and hitting the jar of wild honey on the work table and making it glow like a small, warm lamp. "I argued with you about the north fence because you were going to spend $50 you did not need to spend," she said. "You were right," he said. "I know I was right," she said. "Martin, I have been in love with you since October." He looked at her with an expression of almost unguarded surprise, as if he had constructed careful walls against hoping for this, and was now finding they had not held. "Since October," he said. "Since the morning with the calf," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he reached out and took one of her hands, the one she had dried on the apron, and held it in both of his with the careful steadiness of someone holding something they mean to keep, and she felt the warmth of his hands as if she had been cold for a very long time and had not known it until this moment. "I am not a man who makes speeches," he said. "I know that," she said. "I cannot promise to be easy. I have never wanted easy," she said. "I think," he said, "that if you were willing I would very much like to ask you something." "Ask me," she said. "I am asking if you would consider staying," he said. "Not as the cook, as more than that." "As mine," he paused. "If that is something you would want." She looked at him, at his dark eyes and his caliche-cut jaw and his battered hat hanging on the peg by the door and his hands holding her hand, and she said, "Yes, Martin, that is something I would want." He let out a breath she thought he might have been holding since October. He did not kiss her then, which was Martin Monroe entirely, because he was a man who did things properly or not at all, and properly here meant something more formal, something that had the right structure for what it was carrying. But he held her hand for another moment, and then he said, "I am going to speak to you again tonight after supper," and she said, "I will be here." And he went back to work with the careful directness of a man who has been moving toward something without knowing it and has now found the road. At supper that evening, he was quiet in a different way, not the neutral quietness but the concentrated quietness of a man thinking hard about something specific. The hands talked among themselves and ate their food and did not seem to notice anything in particular, though she caught Emmett looking between her and Martin once with an expression of thoughtful attention, and old Pete ate his supper with the dignity of a man who knows more than he says. After supper, the hands went to the bunkhouse and Belle washed the dishes and Martin sat at the kitchen table, and when she was done and had hung her apron on its hook he said her name. She sat down across from him. He had something on the table between them, a small plain box that she thought she recognized from the shelf in the main room, one of those things that accumulates in a house without anyone remembering its origin. He opened it. Inside was a ring, a simple one, gold, with a small dark stone that caught the lamplight like a piece of sky before a storm. "This was my mother's," he said. "It has been in the box for 12 years. I have not known what to do with it." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me, Belle. I am asking plainly, and I mean it plainly, and I will not be surprised if you need time to think about it because we have not been acquainted for very long, and I am aware that I am asking a great deal of a person to tie themselves to this life, which is not soft." She looked at the ring and then at him. "How long does thinking take?" she said. He looked startled. "As long as you need." "Then it takes about 4 seconds," she said. "Yes, Martin, I will marry you." He looked at her with that open, unarmored expression again, the one that was simply him without the walls, and she thought she could spend the rest of her life working to be worthy of the trust it took him to look at her that way. He picked up the ring and reached across the table and put it on her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her. They told the hands the next morning. Cody made a sound like a man who has just been told Christmas was coming twice this year. Emmett shook Martin's hand and then looked at Belle with an expression of genuine, quiet warmth and said, "I am very glad," with a sincerity that made her eyes sting. Old Pete removed his hat and held it to his chest and said, "Your mother would have approved," to Martin, and Martin looked at him for a moment with something raw in his expression that he then controlled, and said, "Thank you, Pete." In town, Maria Ruiz heard the news and said, "I knew when I saw how that girl walked out to the ranch with her skillet, as though this had been entirely predictable." Hector said congratulations and gave Martin a firm handshake. The minister at the Adobe Church, a good-natured man named Reverend Aldous Webb, agreed to perform the ceremony. They were married on the first Saturday of April, 1879. It was a small wedding in the Adobe Church, not because there was nothing to celebrate, but because they were both people who preferred substance to spectacle. Belle wore her best dress, which was a dark blue wool she had been saving for no particular occasion, and which she had added a white collar to in the weeks before, sewing it by lamplight at the kitchen table while Martin sat with his coffee and watched her with that concentrated, particular attention he gave to things he valued. The dress was plain and the collar was plain, and she was not plain at all, standing at the altar in the April light that came through the two small windows of the church, with her dark hair pinned carefully and the ring already on her hand. Martin wore his best coat, which was black, and a white shirt, and his boots, which she had seen him clean the night before with the focused application he gave to things that mattered. He stood beside her at the altar, and when Reverend Webb asked him to speak his vows, Martin Monroe, who was not a man who made speeches, spoke them with a quiet gravity that filled the small church completely. Emmett and Cody and old Pete were there, and Maria and Hector Ruiz, and a few of the ranchers from the surrounding country who knew Martin, men and women whose lives were shaped by the same land and the same work. There was no elaborate reception. Maria Ruiz had made tamales, because she said no Texas celebration was complete without them, and Belle had made a pie, a beautiful savory pie that was, as Cody pointed out with genuine feeling, at least as good as the birthday pie, and there was coffee and cold drinks and good honest food, and the spring air came through the open church door smelling of grass and new warmth. Late in the afternoon, when the guests had gone, Belle and Martin rode back to the Copper Bell together on the bay horse, Belle riding behind him with her arms around his waist, and the hills were that particular dusty gold of a Texas April evening, and the copper bell on the barn turned slowly in the breeze, and she thought, "I am home." Not in the way you are home in a place you have lived before, but in the way you are home in a place that has been made for you in the same way you were made for it, without plan, without announcement, through the slow and honest accumulation of things that are true. Martin covered one of her hands with his where they rested on his ribs, and they rode without speaking the last half-mile to the ranch, and the silence between them was full of everything. The first year of their marriage was not without its difficulties, because nothing real is without difficulties, and the ranch in 1879 faced a dry summer that tested the water sources and thinned the grass and required hard decisions about cattle numbers and pasture rotation. Martin made those decisions with the same steady competence he brought to everything, but Belle saw the weight of them, the evenings when he came in later than usual and sat with his coffee without speaking, working through something she could not see but could feel in the air around him. She learned not to try to fix those silences. She learned to simply be present in them, to put the coffee cup at his elbow and sit nearby and let the quiet be company rather than a void. Sometimes he would eventually say what he was thinking, and sometimes he would not, but either way he came back to himself, and she was beginning to understand that her presence was itself a kind of anchor, that being simply, consistently, truly, there was the thing he had not had for a long time and needed more than he had words to say. She also expanded the garden that first spring, substantially, bringing in new vegetables, a larger herb section, a small plot of flowers that she grew partly for beauty and partly because certain flowers, dried, had uses in cooking and medicine that the frontier demanded. Martin helped her dig the beds without being asked. One afternoon in late April, coming out after his morning work with a spade, and turning the soil with the methodical thoroughness he brought to all physical labor. And she stood in the kitchen doorway watching him, and thought that love was very often expressed in digging. She was pregnant by June. She had suspected it for about 2 weeks before she was certain, and once she was certain she sat with the knowledge for an evening before telling him, not because she was unsure of his response, but because she wanted a moment alone with it, the fact of this new, enormous thing that was theirs. She told him after supper on a warm June evening when the day was still bright late, the long hours of the Texas summer lingering, and the kitchen was full of the last gold of it. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "We are going to have a child in January, I think." He went very still in the way he had on that March afternoon when she had told him about the pie, the stillness of a man being struck by something larger than he had been holding himself ready for. Then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, an unguarded tenderness so complete that it was almost difficult to look directly at, the way the sun at noon is almost too direct. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "Perfectly well," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his and held it, and they sat in the evening light for a long time without speaking, and the world felt in that moment like exactly the right size. He was, in the months that followed, quietly attentive in a way that was entirely him, not fussy, not hovering, but present and careful in the ways that mattered. He took the heaviest lifting from her without being asked, simply appearing when she was about to carry something heavy, and taking it from her with an economy that required no comment. He brought the water trough closer to the kitchen garden so she did not have to carry buckets as far. He repaired the kitchen chair that wobbled, a thing she had been meaning to mention for months, and said nothing about it until she noticed and thanked him, and he said simply, "I should have fixed it sooner." Emmett Walsh, who was not a demonstrative man, began to check in on her in the kitchen occasionally in the late afternoons when he was between tasks, just appearing in the doorway to ask if anything needed doing, a habit she recognized as protective care expressed in the only language he was comfortable with, utility. She was moved by it. She sent him home with extra biscuits. Old Pete, who had seen many children born on frontier ranches and knew the weight of it, told Belle quietly one afternoon that there was a woman in town, a Mexican woman named Senora Aguilar, who had delivered more babies than the county doctor, and who was the person to have with you when the time came, that the doctor was capable but Senora Aguilar was wise, and there was a difference. Belle thanked him and went to meet Senora Aguilar, a stout, calm woman of about 55 with a manner that combined professional confidence with genuine warmth, and they liked each other immediately. The summer passed and the fall came in, and the dry summer ended in a series of September rains that were as dramatic as the dry had been, coming in off the Gulf in great gray curtains that hit the land and turned the dry creek beds to rushing red water and brought up the grass in a week. Martin stood on the porch and watched the first of the rains with an expression that was as close to pure relief as she had ever seen on him, and she stood beside him and felt the cool, wet air on her face and her heart so full of gratitude it could not have fit more. She was large with the child by October, and she slowed down accordingly, managing the kitchen with the adjustments that the situation required, letting Cody take on some of the heavier tasks and allowing, for the first time since her arrival, a slight loosening of her iron competence, the kind of loosening that is not weakness but wisdom. Martin said nothing about this except to once put his arm around her shoulders when they were standing at the kitchen window watching a sunset and say, against her hair, "You do not have to hold everything together all the time." And she said, "Neither do you." And he said quietly, "No, I suppose not." The baby came on a January morning in 1880, early, before dawn, and Senora Aguilar was there as promised, steady and capable, and Martin sat in the main room through the night in the way of husbands of that time, close but outside the event. And when the child arrived and Belle called him in, He came through the kitchen door with the expression of a man walking into something he was not entirely prepared for and finding it to be exactly right. It was a boy. Martin held him with the careful steadiness he brought to things he valued most, with both hands, the child's head in one palm and the small weight of him supported in the crook of the other arm, and he looked down at the boy with an expression that broke Belle's heart in the best possible way. She watched her husband hold his son in the January lamplight, this man who had lost everything at 19 and built something out of nothing, and kept a receipt in a box for 12 years, and never once mentioned his own birthday. And she thought that love was the best argument available for the proposition that life was worth the trouble it took. They named the boy James after no particular family member, just because it suited him, which Martin said was reason enough. James Robert Monroe, the Robert for Old Pete, whose given name turned out, to everyone's surprise, to be Robert, a fact that old Pete received with such surprised emotion when Martin told him that he had to remove himself to the bunkhouse for a few minutes to recover his composure. James Monroe grew with the particular speed of frontier children, the wide spaces and the outdoor life, and the substantial cooking making him sturdy and curious, and loud in the cheerful way of boys who have never been told to be quiet. He followed Emmett around by the time he could walk, which charmed Emmett greatly and was expressed in Emmett's own way, in small careful gifts, a pocket knife when James was old enough, a fishing line, a lesson on horse gentling. He followed old Pete to church and sat beside him in the pew with the concentrated solemnity of a small person taking a public occasion seriously. He followed his father everywhere, to the barn and the corrals and the pasture, and Martin carried him on the saddle in front of him from the time James was 2 years old, pointing out things on the land with a quiet, unhurried instruction that was simply his way of saying, "This is the world, this is our piece of it, this is yours." In the spring of 1881, Cody Fitch fell in love with a girl named Sarah Totham from a farm on the eastern edge of the county, a lively, dark-eyed girl of 20 who said exactly what she thought and thought quite a lot, and their courtship was conducted with a directness that Belle found refreshing and amusing. Cody came to Belle first, before his own family, which he said he was going to write to eventually, but which he apparently found it easier to tell Belle. He sat in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and said he thought he was going to ask Sarah to marry him, and that he had never done this before and did not know the procedure. Belle told him the procedure was to simply ask, plainly and sincerely, that most women found plain and sincere to be the two best qualities in a proposal. He took this advice and Sarah said yes, and the wedding was in May of that year, and Belle made the wedding pies, savory ones in the copper bell tradition, and they were magnificent. The ranch grew in those years. Martin hired 2 more hands in 1881. And by 1882, the copper bell carried more than 300 head and had a reputation through the county for quality stock, and honest dealing that meant something in the community. Martin was a man people trusted, not because he performed trustworthiness, but because he simply was it, the same way he was honest and fair and quietly generous in ways he would not have called generosity, but that everyone around him knew for what it was. He still did not celebrate things, not as a rule, not with noise or ceremony. But something had changed in him, or perhaps had not changed but had been found, in the way that things that have always been present are sometimes found. He celebrated Belle. This was the truth of it. He celebrated her in the specific, private, daily way of a man who has found the fixed point he has been orbiting since before he knew it. He brought her things from the land, not gifts exactly, just offerings of notice, a hawk feather he had found on the East Ridge, a piece of quartz that caught the light, a branch of prairie smoke flower that bloomed briefly in the spring and which he cut carefully and brought to her kitchen window because he had seen her looking at it from a distance. On her birthday in July, he made sure the workday was lighter, not by announcement but by arrangement, moving the heaviest tasks to the days before, and after so that on her birthday specifically, she had time to sit on the porch in the evening and watch the sky change color without obligation. He did not make speeches about it. He simply showed up on her birthday evening with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her on the porch and watched the sunset with her and was there. She continued to make him a birthday pie every March 5th. This became the fixed point of the year, known to everyone on the ranch, a piece of the Copper Belle's internal calendar. The savory pie with the rosemary and the good butter crust became legend in the county, or close to it, the sort of thing that acquired a reputation through the natural process of multiple people saying it was the best thing they had ever eaten. Maria Ruiz asked for the recipe and Belle gave it with genuine pleasure, and it spread through the community the way good recipes do, becoming in time simply a thing that was made in the area, though people who knew its origin knew where it came from. On Martin's 33rd birthday, March 5th of 1880, she made the pie as she had the year before, and the year before that, and he came in from the north pasture at dinner time and saw it on the cooling rack and looked at her with that expression she knew very well now, the open, unarmored look, and said, "You make me a birthday pie every year." "I do," she said. "Even when the month is difficult," he said, thinking perhaps of the difficult March when a late freeze had taken some of the early calves. "Especially when the month is difficult," she said. He stood beside the cooling rack and looked at the pie and then at her and said, "I want you to know that I do not take it for granted." "I know," she said. "That is why I keep making it." By 1882, the Copper Belle Ranch had 2 hired hands more than it had started with, a productive kitchen garden that Belle had extended to include a small orchard of peach and plum trees, a reputation for the best cattle in the county, and a family. James Monroe was 2 years old and learning words with the avidity of someone who has discovered a very efficient tool. Belle was expecting their second child in the autumn. This child arrived in October, a girl this time, small and fierce and dark-haired like her mother, and they named her Clara, because Belle had always loved the name and Martin said he loved it because she did. Clara Monroe came into the world with an emphatic quality that suggested she intended to take up considerable space, and she fulfilled this promise consistently from approximately her 2nd week of life. Old Pete Garland, who was now past 65 and whose knees were not what they had been, retired from active ranch work in 1882 and moved to a small house in town that Martin had helped him purchase, which Martin had arranged quietly and without announcement because that was how Martin did things. Pete still came to the ranch on Sundays for dinner and brought candy for the children, and sat with Martin on the porch in the afternoon, and talked in the comfortable way of 2 people who have known each other through hard things and have emerged on the right side of them. Emmett Walsh remained at the Copper Belle and became in time the head foreman, taking on the work that Roy Caldwell had once done with a steadiness and loyalty that Martin valued deeply. Emmett never married, not because he lacked feeling, but because his feeling had a specific quality of the permanent which he applied to the ranch and to the family on it, and perhaps that was what he had needed all along. In the spring of 1883, Martin took Belle to the hill above the east pasture where the view of the land was the longest and widest, where on a clear day you could see 20 miles across the brush country to the faint blue line of the hills beyond. He brought her up there on a Sunday afternoon with James on the horse between them and Clara in a sling on Belle's chest, and they sat on the hilltop in the bright air and looked at the land. "Do you remember," Martin said, "when you arrived?" "I forgot to meet the stage." "You forgot the coach came in," she said, laughing a little. "I had to walk 4 miles in the heat with my skillet." "I have regretted that," he said. "Don't," she said. "I needed to walk that road." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because by the time I got to the ranch I had already decided what it was," she said. "I had 4 miles to make up my mind about it and I was already at home before I walked through the door." He was quiet, looking at her with that steady particular attention. "Belle," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have been trying to say something to you for a long time," he said. "Something I have not had the words for." She waited. She was good at waiting for Martin Monroe. She had been practicing for 5 years. "I was a person who was finished with expecting things," he said, measuring the words out with care. "After my parents, after Roy, I had constructed my life around not expecting. The ranch, the work, the land, it was enough because I had made it enough. I had made a rule for myself that it was enough." He paused. "And then you arrived with your skillet, and in approximately 3 months you dismantled the entire rule, and I was not even aware of it happening until it was done." He looked at her. "I am not angry about this." She pressed her lips together to contain something that was not quite laughter and not quite tears, but was somewhere in the country between them. "I am glad," she said. "What I am trying to say," he said, "is that you changed the proposition entirely. It is not that I have more now. It is that I am more. I am the person I was and also the person that living with you has made, and that second person is better, and I thought you should know that." He paused. "I am also trying to say that I love you. I should have said that more often. I am working on it." "I know you love me," she said. "I have known it in every fence you fixed, and every jar of honey, and every morning you took the water buckets before I could reach them. I have known it for a long time." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to say it with words." "All right," she said softly. "I love you too, Martin Monroe. I have since October of 1878, and I have no intention of stopping." James, who was 3 years old and had been sitting between them absorbed in a grasshopper he had found in the grass, looked up at this moment and said, "Pie," with an expectation that suggested he had learned to associate moments of particular family warmth with pie, which was not wrong. Martin looked at him and then at Belle, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it did now, which was not the almost smile of before but the full version, the one she had made room for, and he said, "Yes, I think there is pie," and that was that. The years were good ones. Not because nothing hard happened, because hard things happened as they always do. A drought in 1884 that was worse than the one in the first year, and required belt-tightening and careful management, and the selling of stock Martin would have preferred to keep. A week when James had a fever that scared them badly, and Senora Aguilar came out to the ranch, and they sat through the nights, and he came through it fine, emerging pink and hungry and entirely himself. But the week of it was one of the longest of their lives. A disagreement between Belle and Martin in the winter of 1885 that was sharp and real, and the kind of disagreement that only happens between two people who are close enough to locate each other's exact tender places, and which they worked through with the difficult honesty of two people who had decided that the other person was worth the discomfort of being fully known. But the weight of those years was carried differently than the weight of the years before, because there were two of them carrying it, and that is the difference that love makes in the practical mathematics of a life. In 1886, Belle became pregnant for the third time. She was 32 years old and Martin was 39, and they were not surprised by the arithmetic of having a large family in this time and place, but they were surprised and moved by the continuing fact of it. The third child arrived in the summer, in July, another boy, and they named him Patrick, for no particular reason except that the name suited him, which Martin still maintained was reason enough. Patrick Monroe arrived with a temperament of extreme placidity that made him the easiest baby Belle had ever encountered, and which Martin said was either a profound blessing or an indication that the real character had not yet appeared. By the time Patrick arrived, James was 6 years old and Clara was nearly 4, and the kitchen of the Copper Belle was the fullest room on the ranch. Belle had begun teaching James to read the previous winter, using her mother's recipe book and the Bible, and whatever newspapers and almanacs came through the county, and he had taken to it with the alacrity of someone who has found a thing exactly suited to his particular way of being in the world. Clara was learning to ride, under Emmett's patient instruction, and had opinions about horses that were more emphatic and better informed than some adults. Martin taught his children the land with the same steady, unhurried generosity with which he did everything. He took them with him when they were old enough, showing them the ranch from the saddle, explaining the grass and the water and the cattle with a thoroughness that was really a kind of love letter to the place he had built. He told James, when James was 7 and asking why the Copper Belle was named what it was, that when he had first come to this land it had been empty, and that the name had come to him one evening when he was living in a tent in the Texas wind and had heard a sound, a bell somewhere in the distance, maybe from the church in town, and the sound had seemed to say something about what a place could be, that you could make something that rang, something that had a voice in it, something people could hear and navigate by. James had listened with the focused attention he brought to things he considered important and had said, "That is why it is copper, because copper is what you had." "Copper is what the country had," Martin said. "I used what was here." Belle had heard this from the kitchen doorway and had stood very still listening and had thought, "That is the best description of him I have ever heard. I used what was here." By 1888, the Copper Belle was one of the established ranches of the county, its Copper Belle weather vane known throughout the district, its cattle a byword for quality. Martin Monroe was 41 years old, and in the full authority of a man who has built something lasting and knows it. Belle was 34, still moving through her days with the same competent, attentive grace, the kitchen still her domain and still one of the hearts of the ranch, still making the birthday pie every March, still keeping the calendar with the dates written in the margins. She had added new dates over the years. James's birthday, June 3rd, Clara's October 14th, Patrick's July 22nd, the wedding anniversary, first Saturday of April, the birthday of each of the ranch hands. The birthdays of the Ruiz children, who had grown up alongside the Monroe children. She kept track because someone should, and because she was the person who understood that noticing was itself a form of love. One March evening, the 5th of March in 1889, Martin's 42nd birthday, she brought the pie to the table, and the children crowded around it with the enthusiasm of a tradition they had been born into, and James said, with the gravity of an 8-year-old who has recently learned some history, "Papa, did you know that people used to not have birthday pies before Mama came?" Martin looked at his son with a solemnity that matched him. "Is that so?" "That is what Emmett told me," James said. Martin looked down the table at Belle, who was serving the pie with the slight smile of a person who has been at the center of a family story long enough to know all its versions. She met his eyes. He looked at her with the expression she knew completely, the open, unarmored one, the one that was simply him. "Emmett is right," Martin said. "Before your mother came, I did not celebrate anything." "Why not?" Clara demanded with the directness of a 4-year-old. Martin thought about this with the genuine care he gave to his children's questions. "Because I had not found the right thing to celebrate," he said. Clara considered this, found it acceptable, and went back to her pie. James filed it away with the quiet archival tendency of a boy who is going to be a thinker. Patrick ate his pie with the serene focus he brought to all food and most of life. Belle looked at her husband across the table and the children between them and the kitchen warm and full around them, and felt the weight of all of it, not the heaviness of burden but the weight of something real and substantial, the way good bread has weight, the way good land has weight, because it is made of something actual. That spring brought new grass after the winter rains, the best grass in several years, green across the Copper Belle pastures in the way that was almost unreal if you had not seen this country go from brown to green and back again, often enough to understand that it was simply its nature. Martin rode out to look at the north pasture and came back with the expression of a man whose bet has paid off, the quiet satisfaction of someone who has worked for something specific and found it real. Belle planted the garden in April with the children helping, Clara wielding a small trowel with intensity, James careful and methodical in the row he was assigned, Patrick mostly interested in the earthworms. Martin came by in the late afternoon when the planting was done and looked at the turned earth and the small green starts and said, without particular ceremony, that he thought the peach trees were going to have a good year, and she said she thought so too, and he stood beside her in the garden in the late light, and the world was exactly what it was. That evening after the children were in bed, and the house was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with her mother's recipe book open in front of her. Not reading it, just having it there, the familiar handwriting of a woman long gone, the recipes marked and annotated in her own handwriting alongside. She had been adding to it since she came to the Copper Belle, the birthday pie recipe in her own hand on the last page, dated March 5, 1879, 10 years ago almost. She had been the cook and housekeeper who arrived with a carpet bag and a cast-iron skillet and did not yet know anyone's name. Martin came in from the main room and saw her at the table and came to sit across from her. He looked at the recipe book for a moment. "Your mother's," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have been adding to it." He looked at the pages. "What is the last thing you wrote?" She turned the book so he could see. He looked at the birthday pie recipe in her handwriting, the date, his name, the note in the margin. For a man who deserved to have someone remember the date, he was quiet for a long moment. "I did not know you wrote that," he said. "I wrote it the day after," she said, "after the first one." He looked at it for another moment, then looked at her. "You wrote it for the book," he said, "not for me to see." "For the book," she said, "and maybe someday for James or Clara. So they would know the beginning of it." He sat back and looked at her with the full, steady attention that was the most characteristically him thing about him. And she looked back at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight with the recipe book between them and 10 years of mornings and evenings and the weight of 3 children asleep in the next rooms, and the ranch outside quiet in the spring night, the Copper Belle turning on the barn roof in the soft air. "Belle," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am the luckiest man in this county," he said. "Possibly in the state," she laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her. "That is very specific." "I am a specific man," he said. "You are," she said. "It is one of my favorite things about you." He reached across the table and took her hand, the left one, where his mother's ring sat on her finger where it had sat for 10 years, and he held it in both of his in the way he had that first time and in all the time since. The lamp burned steady. The spring air moved through the kitchen window she had left slightly open. Outside, the Copper Belle sat on its land in the dark, the animals in the corrals, the peach trees budding in the orchard, the pastures greening toward summer. She thought about the woman who had walked 4 miles in the heat with a carpet bag and a cast-iron skillet, and arrived at this porch knowing nothing except that she wanted somewhere honest to be. She thought about the man who had come down the road on a bay horse and taken her bag and walked the rest of the way because she had been walking in the heat, and who had forgotten to meet the coach and said so plainly, and had never, in 10 years, been anything other than entirely himself. She thought about the pie on March 5th, the first one, on the cooling rack in the morning light, and the way he had stood beside it with one hand on the rack and been so quiet, and the way he had looked at her afterward with the open expression that was him without the walls. She thought about the honey jar he had put on the work table, small and glowing in the kitchen light, because he had thought about what she liked. She thought, this is the story of 2 people who found each other in a very large, very plain country, and made something small and true out of it, which turned out to be the largest thing either of them had ever made. "Martin," she said. "Yes," he said. "Happy birthday," she said, though his birthday had been in March and it was now April and the birthday pie had been eaten weeks ago. He looked at her, confused for a moment, and then something in his expression shifted, understanding what she was really saying, which was not about the date but about everything, every year, every morning, every evening at the kitchen table. "Thank you," he said, in the voice he used for things that cost him, for things that were true. "Thank you, Belle." She turned her hand over in his and held on, and they sat together in the lamplight while the spring night moved around the house, and the Copper Belle turned in the slow, warm air, ringing with everything it had been given to say. The years settled into the kind of distance that good years make, not a blurring but a deepening, so that what was 10 years back was still fully present, still available, simply further in a direction that felt like richness rather than loss. James Monroe, by the time he was grown, had his father's directness and his mother's way of noticing things, and he learned the ranch as though he had been born knowing it because, in a sense, he had. Clara Monroe was spirited and capable and had her grandmother's ring someday and her own story to write, which Belle was looking forward to watching. Patrick Monroe grew into his placidity, which turned out not to be absence of character but presence of a particular kind, the steady, rooted kind, the kind that holds things together. Old Pete lived to see them all grown, in a town where people took care of him in return for the long decades of his own care. And when he died on a Sunday afternoon after church dinner at the Copper Bell, quietly, in the chair on the porch where he liked to sit. And there was a service at the adobe church where Martin Monroe, who was not a man who made speeches, said a few sentences about Roy Caldwell and Pete Garland being the truest men he had known, and said it with an evenness that everyone in the church understood for what it was, the economy of a deep feeling held with grace. Emmett Walsh stayed at the Copper Bell until his own age made it impossible to be useful in the way he required himself to be, and when that happened, he moved to a small house in town not unlike Pete's and came to Sunday dinners for as long as he could ride. The red in his hair went gray and then white, and he remained to the end a man who brought wildflowers to the kitchen windowsill without comment. The Copper Bell stayed the Copper Bell. Martin Monroe, growing older, moved through the ranch with the quiet authority of a man who has become part of the landscape he tends, and Belle moved through the kitchen and the house and the garden and the years with the same steady attending that had been her nature since the beginning, making things beautiful and useful and true, noticing what needed to be noticed, keeping the calendar with the dates in the margins. Every March 5th she made the pie. Every March 5th Martin Monroe sat at the end of the kitchen table and had the first slice, and looked at her across the table with the open expression that was him without the walls, and said thank you, and meant everything. Every year Belle said you're welcome, and meant that too. Outside, across the brushy, golden, enormous country of West Texas, the land they had both come to with nothing particular and found to be exactly what they needed, the Copper Bell weather vane turned on the barn roof in whatever wind was moving that day, and its reflection in the late light was the color of something made from what was here, honest and lasting and true. This was the Copper Bell, and these were its people, and the story of how they came to be so was the story of a woman who walked 4 miles in the heat with her skillet and a man who took the bag from her without being asked, and the long, slow accumulation of honest days between that first road and the last. It was, by any measure, a very good story, and it was entirely, beautifully, factually true.